Well, I think that the idea here is that when people are making these kinds of arguments, they're really trying to reinforce the notion that men and women are distinctly different, have distinctive roles, and that they have a specific sexual attraction that's built in from day one. So as a scholar of women, gender, and sexuality, the first kind of comment I would make to that, well, that's assuming heterosexuality would be the first problem with that. But more deeply, we know that men in the military do have sex and attractions to other men, and that women in groups where they're sex segregated do the same thing. So I think that the question here, first of all, from my mind, would be, what is the military going to do about sexual relations, both consensual and, of course, more importantly, those that aren't consensual? And these are something that militaries throughout the world where they've had women join, whether it's in combat or not, have had to try to deal with. And there's many different ways that they can do that, and there's many different lessons, often lessons that we would say we definitely wouldn't want to do that, right? So some militaries, for instance, have requested that women actually have some kind of contraception from day one so they won't get pregnant. That seems to be the primary concern because that would disrupt their capacity on the front lines. So there's different types of concerns. The fact that men might be distracted by women's presence or perhaps feel an urge to protect them is, I think, really tying into stereotypes about men as protectors and women as needing to be protected, that the lift of this ban is exactly challenging. So I think one of the important parts that the military is saying to us here is, look, women can be leaders, women can be powerful, women can be strong, and they can be aggressive. And that really destabilizes our own understandings of gender norms, of what it means to be masculine and what it means to be feminine. So we tend to think of femininity as something that only women really can display, and something that masculinity is something only men can display. And here we have the most masculine of institutions in this country saying, no, actually women have masculine traits as well, and they have them to such an extent that we think that they can serve on the front lines. So while I think these concerns are understandable, I know where they're coming from, I think over time they will diminish. History tells us that full citizenship really can be claimed by people who are willing to give the most to their country. And of course, the greatest sacrifice that anyone can give to a nation state is to lay down their life, or to certainly risk their lives. And conventionally, that's been men. And so we've seen men have been able to claim the greatest rights from their country because they've been able to offer these tremendous sacrifices. And by rights, I don't mean just formal rights like we would see in the Constitution, but they also have a certain status that they can claim. And we see that on particular days and holidays in this country, Veterans Day, of course, coming to mind first. But so they claim a certain status and place in the polity because they are willing to sacrifice their lives. And now what we really are seeing is women saying, well, we're willing to do the same thing. We're willing to sacrifice our lives for our country, and our country is now recognizing that. So opens an opportunity for women to say, we too can claim the greatest rights that this country has to offer. Now what those rights will be, that's up to women in the military, as well as the women's movement to decide what are they going to make of this opportunity. So one could imagine, for instance, the women's movement countering the kinds of arguments we've heard recently in this country about reproductive rights by saying, look, women are willing and able and are risking their lives in combat for this country. Surely they have the right to control their own fertility. So we can anticipate those kinds of arguments coming up in the future in ways that haven't been accessible to the women's movement or women in the military in the past. Right. So there's some kinds of intangible kinds of changes that we can talk about, but I think there are some real practical effects. And the most obvious, and the one that I think most people have talked about, has been the change in women's career trajectory in the military. So what a lot of people are pointing to is that the brass ceiling has now been cracked, right? So we're going to see women being able to move up into the highest echelons of the military, and there's no de facto reason for them not to. Of course, this doesn't mean that informal types of obstacles will somehow disappear, but at least the formal obstacles are gone. And I think that has a number of real practical effects, both within the military and then within the larger society. So within the military, I think we're going to see more ambitious women, as if we didn't already have ambitious women, right, joining the military, but even more ambitious women joining the military because they know there are those formal obstacles are now gone. And I think we're going to see men in the military perhaps respond to women a little bit differently, right? Because now they know that the woman's, standing next to them, who they're meeting perhaps their first day in the military, could perhaps become, a four-star general, right? That if she too sees combat, she can grasp and achieve those high positions of power. And so I think that's going to create a more respectful environment in the long run. Women aren't going to be seen as secondary citizens within the military. And then, of course, women being able to claim these higher positions of power, this has clear effects in terms of their salary that they take home to their families. So we see families in the military benefiting from women being able to move up the ladder of power, and that's going to affect women's status in their own communities. So I think more respect for women in the military within society, and in general, as women be able to move up the ladder of power within the military. Well, there's a couple of really interesting things about gender-based violence in the military. One is that that's not the only problem that the military is facing that's really preventing the institution from thriving. Another issue that they're also facing is high suicide rates. And I had a student last semester who was in ROTC, and she wrote a fascinating paper arguing that the military is really taking on some feminine characteristics and trying to teach recruits to really adopt these characteristics. So in order to counter violence against women and others in the military, and to counter suicide, the military is teaching recruits from day one to be more compassionate, more caring, more nurturing about their fellow soldiers. And so we're seeing the military embrace some aspects of femininity, much as we were talking about also embracing women's masculinity earlier. So the idea here is that the military is really, I think, not necessarily by choice, but by circumstance, is seeing itself having to argue, really, or at least understand that each one of its soldiers can have masculine and feminine traits, and that the best of both of those traits are absolutely essential for the institution to thrive in the 21st century. And that sends a message, it seems to me, to society, right, that all of us can think about those characteristics in ways that can help our institutions thrive. Now, in terms of, sexual assault in the military, we know the rates are high. They're not that much higher than they are in society at large, which I think is really interesting and important. But the problem is that the military has its own system of command and adjudication, so those situations aren't always brought to light, and they aren't always handled. If we think that they're not handled properly in society in general, we can have deep concern about, are they being handled properly in the military, when we know that sometimes the person who's in charge or in command could be the person, right, who's also committing the offense, and then that's the person who then decides whether or not any adjudication should happen. So I think this is an institutional problem about how do we deal with all kinds of issues within the military, not just violence against women or others in the military. And I think if we started to see it within that larger frame, we might be able to make a little bit more traction on the issue. I think that would be easier for the military in some ways. So how are we going to address the problems that are hindering us from becoming, the best institution that we can be in the 21st century? What kinds of changes do we need to make institutionally? Those kinds of questions, it seems to me, can make everyone understand that they need to be answered, not just for women in the military or for people who are victims of sexual assault. So there's different kinds of evidence out there. One of the things that I've taught in a course that I have here at the University of Virginia is looking at women in developing countries. And what we know in those countries is that when different countries, whether it be Guatemala or South Africa, Angola, Mozambique, when they try to overthrow a regime or become independent from a colonial power, is that they need to take up arms. And often the people who are doing that are they need every single able-bodied person they can get, because that colonial power or the existing regime has might on its side. And so what we see is women being invited often to join the military, and sometimes to shame men into joining, right? But often because they need every able-bodied person they can get serving the cause. And what happens is usually women get brought in as support, and we know that women have always been in the military in that role, right? Doing the cooking, doing the cleaning, helping transportation, doing the caretaking that's required in the military. But very quickly in these kinds of struggles, which aren't that different really when one thinks about it, say from Afghanistan or Iraq, there are struggles in which there is no clear front line. There are no trenches, like reminiscent of World War I, say. In those kinds of situations, when the entire population is mobilized, it's very difficult to contain women into one area of resistance. And so very quickly, women move into combat roles. In some countries, they serve more in combat roles than in others. Sometimes 20% of the military, 20 to 30% of the military can be women. And what we see is women in these situations saying, when we were in the bush, when we were in the mountains, we were just like the men. Right, those kinds of gender boundaries, the kinds that you opened our discussion with, right? Will men feel like they have to protect women? Will they just be so tempted by sexual desire that they won't be able to fight the cause? Those kinds of things melt away very quickly, and the camaraderie of the unit really moves to the fore. But women also say that there's a price to pay for that. They can't go and visit their children when they're sick or they need them. And because of the double standards in society, because women are seen as mothers and as soldiers at this moment, that becomes a real struggle for them, that men they didn't feel had those same kinds of strains put on them. They could leave their children, so to speak, behind and not feel the same kind of guilt. And of course, the threat of sexual harassment is very real for women in these situations. But many women say it was, foundational, transformation of their understanding of themselves and their role in society. Unfortunately, what happens after these movements is when the overthrow of the colonial regime or the authoritarian regime is successful, everyone goes back to the way things were before. And often women don't claim the kinds of gains that they made in the military throughout society. So not a lot of them go into politics, for instance, or they don't feed into a women's movement that will really make demands on the state. And some of the places where we've seen exceptions have been rather telling. So in Nicaragua, we see that as an exception, women do move into the state. But of course there the U.S. was very much involved then in limiting the new Nicaraguan regime because it was part of the Cold War struggle. One place where we do see real advances in women's rights, where women were also deeply involved in the military, is South Africa. But again, an exception. So we have to think about, now that women are in combat, now that they're going to be fully integrated into the military, how do we push those gains, right? How do we move them deeper into society and really claim the rights and create the equal society that many of us are looking forward to seeing one day?
Great. Is there anything else that we should touch on, do you think?
I think one last thing I'd want to say is that there's a real political payoff here that people are participating in but perhaps aren't noting. And that is that the debate before, the public debate, was about whether or not women should be in combat. So when I would teach this course, I would ask students, what do you think? Should women be involved in combat or not? And over time I've seen more and more support by students for that. I'm not going to be able to ask that question next year, right? Next year, the question is going to be, well, how well do you think the military is doing in the U.S. at integrating women? How do you think it should change? And just as I'm going to have to change the questions I ask my students, so in the public debate that we're having in this country, the questions are going to change. They're already changing. So while we're seeing a backlash, while some people are arguing that was the wrong decision, very quickly, right, people are going to have to start debating, how are we going to do it? How are we going to integrate women into the military? And the experts who are going to be able to answer those questions are no longer going to be simply the men who've served in combat, They're also going to have to be the women who've been serving in combat but haven't been legally recognized as doing so, and people in other countries who have begun to integrate women into their militaries. And so that means the content of the debate has expanded to be more inclusive, and the people who are engaging in the debate are different. It's a more inclusive debate. And my research shows that when you get a more open and inclusive debate, that's really good for equal opportunity and laws that are going to advance women's rights in the long run. It's interesting, one of the questions that I've asked my students is, right, first of all, do you think women should be integrated into the military fully? Should they be in combat? And then the question, someone in the class will ask it, or I'll ask it if it doesn't come up, do you think that women should have to sign up for selective service? Now, the first few years I asked this question, most of the women in the class were not very enthusiastic about doing that. But more recently, I've had students say, yes, absolutely women should sign up for selective service if we want to claim all of our rights in this society. Then we also have to stand up and be counted for when it comes to those duties and those responsibilities. And this is one of them. And that's usually couched in some kind of response of, I don't want to go to war. I don't think war is a good thing. I don't want to have to kill anyone, but I understand my duties as a citizen of this country. Now, whether that's actually going to filter into the public debate in this country, I'm not so sure. So my sense is that women in the military, I think, would have to begin to push for that because they see it as somehow advantageous for their own position in the military. And then we might anticipate women in the women's movement bringing it up as an issue for discussion. And of course, that's going to bring up many, arguments about whether women should be fighting again. So I don't really see the women's movement as wanting to take this issue up necessarily right now. I think once we've begun to make headway on integrating women into the military, then we can start to think about, well, how can we best do this? Maybe should we do this from day one, right? From once women turn 18, that they should sign up for selective service. So I think that as a conversation that's coming. It's one I'm already having in my classes, but I don't think that it's to anyone's advantage. I also think this is true for people who aren't enthusiastic about women being in combat. It's really not something that's going to push anyone's agenda at the moment, but inevitably I think it's going to come up. The reason I don't think it's going to be particularly embraced by anyone on the right is the whole notion of the draft is something that most politicians just don't want to talk about right now. So I don't see it as something that's going to be a burning issue in public debate. But I do think that if women in the military feel that it would give them an advantage if women were signing up when they were 18, that they will introduce that onto the political agenda and that we'll be hearing about it.